Thank you all for joining us this evening for our Patient-Centered Outcomes Research webinar. I'm Mary Ann Meskis, the Executive Director of DSF, and we have put together this webinar tonight because there's an increasing recognition of the importance of the involvement of patients in the development of research that will directly impact their disease state. In 2018, DSF was fortunate to receive a generous grant from PCORI, which is the Patient-Centered Outcome Research Institute, and it was to allow us to better educate and assemble our community to assure that we were research ready and that we were keeping the patient voice as an active part of identifying our community's research needs and development. So we've decided to develop this webinar to educate our caregivers on patient-centered outcome research, or PCOR. We wanted to make sure that this is available for any attendees who are unable to travel to our biennial conference or attend one of our Day of Dravet workshops. And we will also be presenting this webinar in Spanish later this summer. This webinar is being broadcast live so that we will be able to accept questions from community members in attendance, and it will also be recorded and archived on our website for community members who are unable to join this evening. Some general housekeeping rules. If you haven't joined by audio or if you're having issues, please note that under the audio tab, you can either opt to choose mic and speakers for audio from your computer, or if you're having difficulty with that, please select telephone and a box will pop up with a call-in number. Everyone who is dialed in is on mute, so if you would like to ask a question, make sure to open up your control panel and submit questions and comments via the questions panel. And so with that, I'd like to introduce our presenter for the evening, Nicole Villas. Nicole currently serves as DSF's Scientific Director and Board President. She resides in Colorado with her husband and 3 sons, the youngest of whom has Dravet syndrome. After studying chemistry and physics, she earned her Master's of Science Education from the University of Minnesota. She worked in research and development at the University of Minnesota, as well as for a small chemistry company for several years before teaching chemistry and physics. She uses her background to educate, encourage, and support parents of children with Dravet syndrome. So with that, Nicole, take it away.
Thanks, Mary Ann. I'm excited tonight to be able to present this patient-centered outcomes research webinar to anybody who wasn't able to make it to one of our previous sessions. A lot of you, if you have already made it to those previous sessions, you may have seen this content. However, we're trying to reach everybody in the community, so we're trying to reach the people that couldn't travel to our biennial conference, that can't make it to our 5 Day of Dravet events in the fall. So we're excited to be able to put this out there and let people access it at their own time. This webinar was made possible, like Mary Ann said, through a Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute Eugene Washington PCORI Engagement Award. We were very excited to receive it in 2018. We are we're starting our second year of projects right now, and we have a lot of things going with this grant, and this webinar is just one of them. Again, as Mary Ann said, if you dialed in by phone, you are automatically on mute. If you logged in on your computer and you're using your computer speakers, you're also on mute. Please use the chat window to ask any questions. Mary Ann will interrupt me if there are questions that come up that are important during the presentation. Otherwise, we'll have a question and discussion session at the end of the presentation as well. We're grateful you're here tonight. So we have a few things to accomplish tonight. On our agenda, we're going to go through what exactly patient-centered outcomes research is, and also what comparative effectiveness research is, or CER. We're going to talk about the importance of an engaged community, which is really relevant for the Dravet syndrome community because we are so small. We're going to talk about how DSF is making PCOR meaningful in Dravet syndrome, so not just tackling patient-centered outcomes research to check it off the list, but actually making it meaningful to our community. And then we'll talk about what the next steps might be for you to participate as an individual. So if you haven't seen this before, patient-centered outcomes research is a wonderful branch of research that really takes the patient voice into account, and it starts in the design process. So patient-centered outcomes research, the goal is to help people make informed decisions about their healthcare, to make them have educated decisions, to give them all of the information so that they can decide what's best for their particular case. But it really starts in the design process. So as this research is going forward, it needs the patient voice to set outcomes at the start. And outcomes, if you're not familiar with that term, are what you will measure to decide whether your study was successful or to decide whether your treatment was successful. So lots of studies start with the outcomes. You decide what you're going to measure, and then you decide how you're going to measure it. You decide the design. But really, that outcome is the #1 component in research when you're thinking about starting design. Patient-centered outcomes research will tackle patient-centered issues like assessing the benefits and harms of treatments to inform decision-making. So a lot of the clinical trials that our children have gone through or that they may be going through in the future can address efficacy of a medication, but it often doesn't really assess the benefits and harms of the treatment. So they might list side effects, and you might get some data on potential side effects, but really looking at the side effects that aren't necessarily listed exactly from that medication that might have an effect on gait or a downstream effect. Really looking at those kind of things would be more patient-centered than efficacy of, in our case, an anti-seizure medication. It can establish outcomes that matter to patients, like we talked about before. Outcomes that might matter to patients might not be the outcomes that researchers think they should study. So when researchers first started making anti-seizure medications, their number one goal was to reduce seizures. But we know as parents that oftentimes the seizures are not the hardest thing that we deal with. Sometimes it's behaviors. And if our children are on medications that increase or exacerbate their negative behaviors, even if they reduce seizures, that's not really an effective treatment for our family or for our children. So we really want to establish outcomes that matter to patients, that they care about. It's very inclusive of preferences and needs. So patient-centered outcomes research really tries to get at the individual. So instead of looking at what's best for a group, it really focuses on that individual and says, in your case, knowing your child and the potential benefits and harms to your child, what's best in your situation, which I think is really important because Dravet syndrome is obviously a condition where there are a lot of unique children. There are unique cases. No child is alike. Nobody responds to treatment the same. So I think this is a really important part of patient-centered outcomes research. It incorporates a wide variety of settings and diversity of participants to address individual differences and challenges. This is also important because in a rare disease community like Dravet syndrome, a lot of our medical advisory board members or our specialists are located in specific pockets of dense populations in the country, and we're not necessarily serving the rural patients as well. And so people that can't get to our centers of excellence, people that for whatever reason their insurance doesn't cover our children's hospitals, those are the people that we need to serve, and patient-centered outcomes research can help serve those people as well. It optimizes outcomes while addressing the burdens to patients. We've kind of talked about this before, but really the idea is to give patients and their caregivers the tools to be able to say, what is the best treatment for my child at this time? It can answer questions like, given my personal characteristics, conditions, or given my child's seizure burden or my child's seizure types, what should I expect will happen to me with X treatment? Or what are my options? What are the potential benefits and harms of those options? So looking at 3 different medications, if your doctor says, well, what would you like to try next? And a lot of us parents say, aren't you the doctor? We don't know. Patient-centered outcomes research seeks to arm us with the tools to be able to answer those kind of questions. What can I do to improve the outcomes that are most important to me? So it really asks patients to prioritize what is important to you. If it's quality of life, what specific quality of life do you need to address to make sure that your treatment is successful? And then how can clinicians and the care delivery systems that they work in help me make the best decisions about my health and my healthcare? So looking at your child's team, are there ways that we can coordinate care better? Are there ways that we can deliver healthcare better? Those are all patient-centered outcomes research questions. Some great examples of PCORI that are not Dravet syndrome specific, but have come up on the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute website are blood clots and blood thinning drugs. So this study aimed to reduce the risk of fatal blood clots during stays in the hospital. And what they found was that prompting healthcare providers not to skip doses resulted in a significant decrease in missed doses. So that's pretty intuitive, right? I think we could all figure that out. But it actually takes a study sometimes to point out that actually reminding them not to skip the dose actually makes them not skip the dose. So that's an example of how can we improve the outcome for patients in really simple manners. Reducing medical errors in the hospital. This is a common area of patient-centered outcomes research topics. So this project sought to add caregivers, parents of children in the pediatric ward to the rounding system that they would do. And they found that a lot of errors were reduced, and it was often by parent questions, by parent input, things that the residents and the people rounding would kind of forget or might skip. Adding the parents who know their children best reduce medical errors in the hospital. And then chronic disease and care transitions. I put this one in here because transition of care for pediatric patients in Dravet syndrome to the adult world is a hot topic in our community right now. So I wanted to show you that patient-centered outcomes research can also apply to the transition of care. This study was transition of care out of a chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD, out of an acute care setting into a home care setting, but this could also apply to pediatric to adult services as well. So PCORI is usually accomplished by comparative effectiveness research, which is a fancy term for basically saying research that compares two different things that are already proven to work, or three different things, two or more things that are already proven to work. So comparative effectiveness research makes comparisons between proven effective treatments. It doesn't have to have patient data reported or patient-reported data. It can look at chart reviews, it can look at genetic studies, lots of different ways to do comparative effectiveness research. On the flip side, patient-centered outcomes research is almost always patient-reported outcomes, because if we're deciding the outcomes, we better have a say in how they're measured and that measurement step along the way. They don't have to be comparative, but they often are. And then you see this traditional PCOR, so traditional patient-centered outcomes research is usually where those two overlap, because comparative effectiveness research is considered kind of the clinical gold standard in research, and patient-centered outcomes research is sometimes a little bit softer. And when you can combine those two, you can get a really strong study in traditional PCOR. Examples of things that are not patient-centered. You probably can't read these, but maybe your second time through you'll be able to. These are just abstracts of research studies that have come out in the past year. One is regarding RNA sequencing analysis of SCN1A knockout mice. So basically a Dravet syndrome mouse model where they've knocked out the gene and then analyzing the RNA sequencing. Questions. This would not be patient-centered outcomes because there's nothing that we can do in our children about their RNA sequence, right? Most parents don't even know what the RNA sequence is. There's nothing we can do about it. Not a patient-centered outcome. Questions like, how does circadian rhythm affect mice with Dravet syndrome might sound patient-centered, because I think a lot of our parents would be interested in the idea of circadian rhythm and how it affects seizures in our population. But really, a study in mice doesn't offer any practical solutions, and probably doesn't offer any practical solutions that our patients could actually try or haven't tried yet. So it might seem patient-centered, but that's an example of one that is not actually patient-centered. Which medications are best for treating comorbidity A or comorbidity B? I'd like to say which medications are best for improving behavior or improving cognition. Well, that's not patient-centered because it assumes patients are interested in adding a medication, and a lot of our patients don't want to add any more medications. So when we'll get into the process that our clinicians use to kind of go through some of these PCOR questions, and one of the things that they assumed was that they could do a study comparing one behavior medication to another behavior medication in Dravet syndrome, and the parents on the group stopped them and said, wait a minute, we don't want to add any more medications. They're on enough. We don't want another behavior medication. What techniques can we try to improve behavior instead? So that's an example of one that would seem patient-centered, but actually is not. And then the usual is CBD effective in treating seizures in Dravet syndrome, or is fenfluramine effective? Anything where it says, is it effective in treating seizures, is probably not patient-centered, because seizures may not be the #1 concern for the patients. Doesn't address side effects or potential harms either. So when you ask if something's effective, it's not taking into consideration the individual patient. You can also have study designs that aren't patient-centered, where the question might be patient-centered and the idea might be patient-centered. The outcome may very well be patient-centered, but the design might not be. You can have too many appointments that require travel. That would not be considered patient-centered, because patient-centered research is all about the patient's perspective. If the patient is already burdened because they're going to the clinic too many times, it's not going to be a patient-centered study. Too much outside work required if there are elaborate seizure diaries, therapy interventions. If you're asking people to do a behavioral intervention that's 5 hours a day, 7 days a week, that's probably not going to be a very patient-centered study. Invasive procedures or tests. Large placebo groups. Remember, placebo is the word for what used to be thought of as a sugar pill, but it's not a sugar pill. It's just a pill that has the same ingredients, but not the active ingredient as a medication that's being studied. So large groups where the patients are not actually getting the treatment or not being allowed to adjust treatment when necessary for the health of the patient is not patient-centered. And outcome measures and questionnaires that do not adequately measure the issues in Dravet syndrome would not be patient-centered. So if you think you're measuring behavior, even though that might be a very patient-centered outcome that you're looking at, but you're actually measuring it on some scale, some autism scale that doesn't really accurately measure behavior in our patients, that's not a patient-centered study design. So you can fall into a trap of thinking you're doing patient-centered research, but not actually doing patient-centered research, both with the outcomes, the questions, and the study design. So what is patient-centered? So what is a good example of a patient-centered outcomes research study? And this one that came out that involves Marianne and several other advocates in the Dravet syndrome community and other rare epilepsy communities was a great example. So this study wanted to know what seizure burden is typically, what the seizure burden actually is in Dravet syndrome. So is it, and not just Dravet syndrome, other epilepsies, is it the seizure frequency? Is it the seizure severity? Is it some other? Is it the unknown? What is actually most burdensome to the patients or the caregivers? And so they got caregivers together and they asked them. And this study went through and it identified, okay, most caregivers said that it was actually the unknown that was the hardest, followed, I don't remember exactly what the results were, followed by frequency or severity. But this was one that was really well designed because they brought the caregivers together, they asked them, and they did not make assumptions. Study designs that do accommodate patients and caregivers include short, infrequent visits. If they can be combined with another already existing office visit, all the better. Inclusive recruiting and participation. So you can't say that something is patient-centered if you haven't done your best and gone out of your way to recruit those who wouldn't otherwise know about your study. So you need to look at socioeconomic factors, you need to look at regional factors, you need to look at race, you need to make sure you have a good gender match, you need to make sure you have good age range. Some of the recent clinical studies that were done in our population were criticized for not including adult patients. I would argue that they're not entirely patient-centered because we do have an adult population and they did want to be included. So making sure that you're getting all of the subpopulations is important. So PCORI and comparative effectiveness research in common diseases looks like that slide that we were at a couple slides ago, where there was a big overlap of comparative effectiveness research and patient-centered outcomes research. That's great in common diseases, in heart disease, in diabetes, in lots of different diseases that works. You have PCORI and CER that effectively helps patients make educated decisions about their individual healthcare. In Dravet syndrome, it looks a little bit different. Unfortunately, because Dravet syndrome up until last year didn't have any treatments approved for even treating the seizures, there's not a lot of comparative effectiveness research. So remember, CER has to compare 2 or more already proven techniques or treatments in the disease. Well, we didn't have any that would reduce seizures. We certainly didn't have any that would reduce negative behaviors or improve cognition. So we don't really have any comparative effectiveness research. That circle is actually probably even bigger than it should be. We do have an increasing number of patient-centered outcomes research that's not necessarily comparative effective, but we do have some of those coming out. So we've got a growing amount of PCORI, I think largely in thanks to the grant that Marianne procured for DSF 2 years ago. So I think we've done a good job of increasing the PCORI, but we really don't have any CER left, which means that there's no traditional PCORI/CER research to help caregivers make informed decisions. And we'd like to close that gap. To do that, we need to engage the community. So again, the saying that I put on every presentation, nothing for us without us. So we need our community, we need all of you watching, we need all of our patients to understand their place in the design process. Engaging the community starts with the patients. So many diseases, unlike Dravet syndrome, are small, they are disorganized, and they don't have good advocacy groups. We are very, very lucky in the Dravet syndrome community to have DSF, who is working on organizing our patient group. Because if we did still exist as a small and disorganized patient group, our caregivers would be disengaged and unprepared. They wouldn't understand the research process, they wouldn't be prepared to participate, and they wouldn't know what opportunities were available to them. If they are unprepared and don't know what opportunities are available to them, there's no way that they're going to have their concerns prioritized. So if you want to move research forward in a patient-centered way, you need to prioritize the community's concerns, and small, disengaged, unprepared communities can't do that. If your patient concerns are not prioritized, you're not going to get a lot of clinicians who are going to look at wanting to investigate studies on that, because they don't know what the community wants to see. So even if they wanted to do patient-centered outcomes research, they wouldn't have the tools to actually do it. In our community, unfortunately, we do have few proven treatments. So this is one area of the journey that we are kind of struggling with and we'd like to improve on. There may be nothing to compare, no comparative effectiveness research. Another stumbling block is that small, disorganized patient groups don't have little funding, or don't have much funding. They have very little funding. We are lucky that DSF has done a great job of fundraising, and we can fund a lot of these studies. And the unprepared community cannot effectively participate in patient-centered outcomes research. So if you are watching and you are from another rare disease and you are looking to engage your community, there are some tips that we actually stole from another small disease group that has done this before us, and they had some strategies for effective engagement. First, ask the community what's important. You can use, there are so many great tools. There are Facebook polls, there's SurveyMonkey, there are a million tools that you can use. Ask them what's on their mind. What do they want to see? DSF did this in 2016 in a formal way with a survey to our patient community, and then we were able to analyze those results and actually publish them and make them available for the clinicians, which was very helpful. The second step is bring the caregivers to the table. Make it easy. Limit travel, offer sibling care. So in these rare diseases that have a heavy seizure burden or heavy other burden, it's difficult for these families to travel. They can't go to a biennial conference. They can't get to some place that's halfway across the country, and they don't know what to do with their other children. So make it easy. One way that DSF has done this is by offering our 5 annual Day of Dravet events across the country. So we've divided the United States into 5 groups or 5 regions, and in each region we have an event that has a big portion of PCORI in it, and that event moves throughout the region. So say the Midwest region, it might be in Chicago one year, and then the next year it might be down in Missouri or somewhere else relatively Midwest. Include everyone, not just the people that have the time and money to travel. So even if they have a relatively well seizure controlled child, they might not have the money to get to a conference. So again, move it around, don't make it expensive, offer resources in other languages. And then let them talk. You don't have to, this is a terrible example because I'm sitting here presenting and then we're going to talk. But in all of our face-to-face events, the bulk of these workshops have been the patients talking, and that's where we get the most information, is when they just talk to each other. Guide discussion, don't limit it. Use live polling, let their voices be heard around the room. There's nothing more powerful than having a presenter or somebody in the front of the room ask you a question and you type in your response thinking you're in the minority, and then see it flash on the screen and realize you're actually in the majority. That's powerful. Compensate them. So if you're a rare patient disease group and you were going to have speakers, if you were going to have scientists or clinicians come and speak to other professionals or to the community, you would offer them an honoraria. So do the same thing with your caregivers. Compensate them. They deserve a gift card, a Visa gift card, or some other, maybe if you can't do that, maybe it's swag from your rare disease, whatever it is. Their time is just as valuable as the professionals, and I would maybe even argue more valuable. And then provide updates. Don't leave them hanging. Let them know how their perspective drives research. So tell them what you're doing. Tell them what changed because of their opinion. This is a great video. When we first, I'm not going to play it, but when I invite you to go to YouTube, the link is down at the bottom, and watch it sometime and really think about what I'm going to say next. Because when we first started this project of getting clinicians and all the stakeholders in the room together on a task force, we invited clinicians, we invited researchers, we invited industry, we invited parents of all ages, we invited parents of different socioeconomic backgrounds, and we got them together, and we realized that the clinicians and the researchers and the professionals didn't necessarily understand the parents' perspective. And so Marianne and her team were amazing and made this video that followed one family from before dawn when their child was still sleeping all the way till they put the child to bed that night. And the interesting thing about this video, it's 8 minutes long. It's called A Day in the Life with Dravet Syndrome. The interesting thing about it is that seizures were a very small part of this child's day. So this family was busy from dawn until dusk, and seizures were only mentioned in about 2 minutes of this 8-minute video. And the rest was behaviors, it was therapies, it was tantrums, it was learning how to go to the bathroom. And it was just so powerful. We played it for our stakeholder group, and they really appreciated understanding all of the different aspects that go into caring for someone with Dravet syndrome. So our next topic is making PCORI meaningful in Dravet syndrome. And like we talked about before, there's not much proven effective in Dravet syndrome. So unfortunately, we have to start from the beginning. The PCORI process in a rare disease like Dravet syndrome starts with prioritizing the patient concerns. Once you prioritize their concerns, you can maybe select a topic, what you're going to study. Once you select the topic, you design how you're going to study. That's where the outcomes come in. Then you participate, so you do it. And by participate, I don't mean you run the study, I mean you ask the caregivers for their participation, and then you disseminate and teach. For DSF, this looked like, the timeline looked like below the PCORI process. We started in 2016 with our patient and caregiver survey. We were able to get a really good handle on what our caregivers' concerns were, and then we spent the next 2 years, we're still working on this one, we spent the next 2 years selecting topics. So what can we study? Of those concerns, what is reasonable and feasible to study? We're working with a lot of different clinicians right now on designing studies around those concerns. So how do we study those now? One of the ones that we've been discussing with the clinician is gait. How do we study gait? In Dravet syndrome, it deteriorates sometimes very rapidly, but often between the ages of about 18 months and 20, you'll see a very significant decline in how our patients walk. And we don't exactly know why, and we don't exactly know when it happens, and we'd like to know those things. So designing that is where we're working on now. In 2019 and 2020, we hope to be able to participate in these studies. I hope to be able to participate as well, and hopefully we'll be able to teach in 2021, although that might be 2022. So in 2016, again, what we did is we went out to our caregivers, we created a long survey for them. It was multiple parts, and we were able to publish those results in Epilepsy and Behavior. And what we found was that after seizure control, the most common concerns were speech and communication, sibling impacts, cognitive developmental delay and regression, and behavioral issues. So those were kind of the top things that we focused on. We did add in a couple other ones in some of our Day of Dravet discussions, but that was a powerful table so that our clinicians know what we as a community care about. In 2017, we started, like I said, the stakeholder group, and we brought together everybody that could possibly be involved in one of these studies, from the clinicians to the researchers to the industry members, so pharmaceutical to the patients of all different ages. The one stakeholder that we didn't include that I wish we would have been able to was insurance representatives. So they're a big stakeholder because our families have difficulty getting access to really expensive new medications in the epilepsy community, and I really wish that we had been able to include them as well. You want all the stakeholders at these meetings. We categorized our discussions into sleep, behavior, nutrition and GI, seizures and status epilepticus, which are prolonged seizures if you're not familiar with Dravet syndrome, gait, and SUDEP. So then we were able to take each of those categories, and we were able to really talk about them with the caregivers at our workshops. So again, there was one workshop held in each region of the country, in each of 5 regions in the country throughout the fall of 2017. And we talked about those topics. And some of the questions that our stakeholder group had come up with, we presented to the caregivers. So our stakeholder group, which had monthly conference calls, had wanted to know, is melatonin or clonidine better for improving sleep? Is medicine or behavioral therapy better for improving duration of sleep? And the interesting thing when we talked to the caregivers, when we let them kind of run with this, was that they didn't want to give more melatonin. They didn't want to give clonidine. They were not interested in medications for sleep. So that was really powerful, that even though we had patient representatives on that stakeholder group, when you ask the community, you might be missing something obvious that you think you had addressed and you hadn't. Other possible questions that our stakeholder group came up with and that our Day of Dravet participants discussed were ABA or applied behavioral analysis therapy or medical management, for addressing behavior. Is there an abbreviated behavior test? So one of the issues that we struggle with in Dravet syndrome is that there's no good way to measure behavior. It's not a simple autism checklist. I shouldn't say simple. It's not a well-documented autism checklist that works for our children. Gait, there's a wonderful doctor up in Canada who treats a lot of adult patients with Dravet syndrome who has tried levodopa, an amino acid, in treating the gait and seen some improvement in some of her patients. So that was one that we thought our stakeholders in our community would want to see. And then we just went on with other questions. At this point in our project, we were still hoping to be able to apply for a comparative effectiveness research grant from the PCORI Institute. So we were kind of trying to take a square peg and fit it into a round hole, or a round hole in a square peg. And we've kind of gotten away from that because we did have to take a step back and say, wait a minute, there's really not anything that is proven effective in Dravet syndrome, even if it's proven effective in autism, and our patients have characteristics of autism. I don't think that counts as being proven effective in Dravet syndrome. So we did kind of take a step back after we developed these questions and said, wait, maybe comparative effectiveness research, although the gold standard, isn't necessarily right for our community, and that's okay. So in 2018, we checked back with our community because it had been 2 years since the survey that we sent out. So we checked back in with them and said, okay, are we still on the right track? Are we still looking at the right categories? And it turned out that we were still looking at the right categories. Maybe their orders had shifted a little bit as our population shifts, but the categories were still correct. We did not list cognition as a category, but it was written in by enough people that it needed to make it onto the graph. And then at the 2018 conference, so this was last summer, we continued these conversations with 2 caregiver workshops. One was more of a presentation and a question and answer with a professional, and then the next morning we had a really big workshop where we focused on discussions, the roundtable discussions like we talked about before. A lot of the patient-centered outcomes research work that we've been doing in the last 3 years really came to fruition with our conference, not just in this Eugene Washington Engagement Award, and not just in this project, but in the other presentations. So I do believe that our clinicians and the people studying Dravet syndrome have taken note that we have some patient concerns and we want them addressed. Things like the presentation that Lori Bailey from Zogenix gave on their sibling survey data, that actually came from the 2016 survey that we did, where we noted, you know what, sibling concerns are really important to us. So Zogenix kind of took that feedback from our community and ran with it, and they're doing wonderful, wonderful research on that topic for us, which is fabulous. And then again, let the caregivers talk. Don't spend so much time speaking like I am tonight.
Nicole, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you did have a question. One of the attendees was wondering who the adult Dravet neurologist is who is treating gait problems.
Sure. So Dr. Danielle Andrade, I believe, is she in Toronto, Marianne?
I think she is.
I think she is too. Dr. Danielle Andrade is treating a lot of adult patients in Canada, and we are so grateful. She actually joined our medical advisory board this year. So we are excited to have her as an expert in adults with Dravet syndrome, as much of an expert as there can be. So last fall, for our Day of Dravet workshops, again, these are held 1 in each region of the country, so 5 of them across the fall. We decided it was time to move on from just thinking about concepts and our patient concerns, and it was time to move on to actually designing a study. So we asked our caregivers to focus on outcomes. And we told them at the workshops that outcomes have to be, I need my mouse back. Outcomes have to be well-defined, so they can't be broad. It can't be like, does cognition improve? You have to actually define it. Does this aspect of cognition improved? They have to be measurable. So not only do you have to ask, does this particular aspect of cognition improve, but you have to ask, does this particular aspect of cognition improve as measured by, and then have some sort of measurement tool. And those 2 are really important characteristics for actual outcomes, because outcomes determine the study's failure or success. You may hear in clinical trials that they met their primary outcome, or they met their secondary outcome, or they didn't. I hope they met their primary outcomes. If they don't meet their primary outcome or objective, the study is determined to be a failure. So outcomes are really important, and they're difficult to write. So we had our caregivers kind of practice with that. It was a bit of a leap, but we're hoping that we can continue that discussion this fall. We had our caregivers pick a topic. So as we told them to think about possible outcomes, we had them hone in on a topic. So this group, for example, picked the topic cognition. There's behavior in parentheses, but they were really looking at cognition. So one of the issues is regression, and a potential outcome that they came up with was reduce or maintain chronological versus cognitive age. So that's a pretty good outcome, right? To actually study this, you need to know what measure you're using, so what survey you're using. There are a couple different ones out there, so you'd have to hone in on that pretty well, but they got it. They wanted to reduce chronological versus cognitive age. Excellent. They went on to do a couple other topics. Another group picked cognitive quality. Same thing, cognition. They wanted cognitive quality in all of these issues, but their potential outcomes were more sleep, better quality, better seizure control. So they're kind of across the board there. So it's interesting when you go back to your caregivers and ask them to come up with outcomes. A caregiver's idea of an outcome is very different than a researcher's idea of an outcome, and it's important that we acknowledge that, because both are okay, and try to get on the same page. Other discussion groups chose behavior. One brave group chose SUDEP, which is sudden unexpected death in epilepsy, which is a common cause of death in our kids with Dravet syndrome or adults with Dravet syndrome. So it was really interesting. We have written records of all of the groups in all of the 5 regions talking about these discussions, and it's really powerful to go back to them at a later time, even if you were involved in those discussions, and look and see what they came up with and what's on their mind. So I highly suggest, if you're thinking of doing this in another rare disease, I highly suggest that you keep these notes and take photographs of them, because they're powerful to go back to. Which brings us to our next steps. So in 2019, we are hoping to, again, work on this design component. So we might not be able to come up with exact outcomes to be measured, but we might be able to get into designs that might work for our population. So we hope to be able to ask caregivers, now that they have some experience under their belt with some clinical trials and some other research studies, what's working for you, what's not working for you. We hope to be able to ask them, what would you be able to do from home? What patient-reported statistics would you be able to accurately give clinicians? So those are the things that we hope to do at our fall 2019 Day of Dravet Caregiver workshops. There are the list of where they are. Is Michigan still changing, Marianne, or is that still on?
I believe it's going to stay on October 26th.
Okay, great. Other things that we're working on, again, in 2019, continue the priority area discussion. We always want to come back to that, because even though we feel like we got it pretty nailed down between 2016 and 2018, it can always change. It never hurts to go back to it. We want to still continue the outcomes discussion. We'd like to continue natural history design and participation discussion. We've made some progress on that over the last year, and also hit some roadblocks on that in the last year. The butterfly observational study through Stoke Therapeutics is somewhat patient-centered in that they're looking at behavior and cognition, and I believe they're looking at a gait a tiny bit. I can't remember the design exactly, but they're looking at things beyond just treatment effects, because there is no treatment in that study. So I consider that one patient-centered. We're working on a gait study with Dr. Ian Berg, trying to get that up and running, and some of her gait analysis labs, and we're hoping that will be very patient-centered, in that we have lots of patients working on the design of that study. We're giving input, and we hope to have a lot of the data actually come from the patients as well, in terms of videos that they will submit, and maybe some home walking tests or things like that that they can send into the gait lab. In 2019, as far as the Eugene Washington PCORI Award goes, we are working on summaries of our work. We will include those in white papers that will end up being somewhat of a position paper on the importance of the patient voice in Dravet syndrome. So the one thing that we have found is that even Marianne and I, as parents of patients with Dravet syndrome, even we make assumptions that we shouldn't for our community sometimes. So the patient voice needs to be present. It needs to always be checked in, and it can't be just one patient, but 1 or 2 active community member. It needs to be, you need to go out and reach the ones who are quiet, because their opinion matters. And then there are other natural history studies, perhaps coming along, not in the US, where they have more centralized healthcare and can get this data across multiple care centers in a little bit more organized way. So that's what we're working on at DSF. We're really excited about this project. I think that one of the things that we have been able to do with the Eugene Washington Award that kind of goes unnoticed is train ambassadors to be our voice in the community, to make sure that the patient-centered outcomes research idea is being spread all the time, everywhere, because it is so important. So Marianne and her staff have done a great job of training ambassadors and coming up with different ways to get the information to them, different ways for them to disseminate it amongst their community. And that brings us to the better part, which is questions and discussion. I shouldn't be up here talking in a patient-centered outcomes research webinar. So if there are questions, I would love to hear them.
So you did have a few
comments.
I was going to say, you did have a few questions that came in, and then also there were a few questions that were submitted before the webinar. So I'm going to start first with the ones that came in during. So one of the attendees was wondering if it's advantageous to treat gait problems with L-dopamine when they are, versus the long-term effects from L-dopa. And she was hesitant to put her daughter on this.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think we know. We don't have enough data. So that's a great question. And knowing whether there are bad long-term effects is a patient-centered outcome that we would like to know what's the potential harm. So we don't have enough data on that right now. There's probably data on long-term effects in other diseases because L-dopa is not a new medication by any means. It's just new to the Dravet syndrome population. So there may be data on other diseases, but as far as our own children, we don't know.
Okay. The next question was, how can we learn about patient-centered research studies if they become available and get involved if we can't attend Day of Dravet?
So that's a great question. I would say the best way is to make sure that you're registered in our family network. So if for anybody who's watching who doesn't know what our family network is, go to www.dravetfoundation.org and click, I should know exactly where to click. I believe it's under newly diagnosed and then register for the family network. Correct me if I'm wrong, Marianne.
You can also, under Get Involved tab, you can also access it that way by going directly to DSF Family Network under that tab.
Great. So that family network is where we keep the list of patients and where they are. And so lots of times we'll have clinicians who are only working at their hospital and they just want to know, you know what, do you have like 10 patients in the Cleveland area who are between the ages of 5 and 10 that I could maybe do a study like this on? And then we can go back to them. We never share your names ever, but we can go back to them and say, yeah, I think there are about 10 of them there. Or we can go back and say, you know what, there's really not a big enough population in that age range there. Why don't you try Los Angeles or something like that? So that's probably the best way. We do reach out to people directly from the family network. We also make sure that we include that kind of information. Any opportunities to participate in research, we include in our newsletter. Which, do they automatically get signed up for the newsletter when they sign up for the family network, Marianne?
They have an option to opt out if they don't want to receive it.
Okay, so that's the best way.
And then this next question is in a somewhat similar vein where one of the patient families was asking, can they be connected with someone who is studying gait problems and they're located in British Columbia, Canada?
Great, so I would suggest, I didn't put my email on here, but it's Nicole at dravetfoundation.org. So just send an email to me and CC Marianne, Maryanne, at dravetfoundation.org, and just ask us. Just make sure you're on our radar, and we'll let you know if there's somebody studying there, and if there isn't, we'll keep you on a list for future studies.
And then the next one is a family from the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area. And she says that there is less information that I get. I'm not sure if I quite understand this question. And she's trying to follow DSF to get more information.
Okay.
And she just wanted to know what she can do to make sure that she has the opportunity to receive updates or participate in trials. So again, in a similar vein to the last two questions.
Yeah, again, sign up for the family network. You do not have to be a patient to be on the family network. We have professionals who have signed up as well, and Marianne and the staff do a great job of routing them to the right location or the right list. Sign up for the family network, follow us on social media. So we do a lot on Facebook, our public page, Dravet Syndrome Foundation, posts updates. We always post opportunities for involvement in clinical trials because companies are always worried about not getting enough patients in their trials, so they almost always reach out to us and say, hey, I've got this little flyer, can you send this out to your community? And we always post those on social media, so you'll see them. Twitter, we're doing a good job of now this year. The staff has really upped their presence on Twitter and Instagram as well, so those are great ways.
You have another question that asked, is the butterfly study a natural history, and how can we get involved?
So yes and no. It is sort of a natural history in that it is an observational study. So there are no treatments involved. There are no interventions. They just want to see over the course of 2-ish years, 2 to 4 years, they want to see what happens with a particular child in certain areas that they're going to measure. So in some sense, it is a natural history because you are following the natural course of the disease without intervening. In other senses, it is not a natural history because they're asking they're asking slightly limited questions in terms of they're not looking at the entire disease. So they're not looking at the whole disease from gait, from channelopathy, from seizures, from temperature regulation. They're not looking at all of that stuff. They're looking in targeted areas. And the purpose of their study is to be able to see whether their genetic approach that they have hoping to go into the clinic next year will be able to show efficacy in some of those other areas. So that's why they're doing this study. It's going to be a benefit to our community for sure, because we need to know these things, but it is not a comprehensive natural history study.
And I think it's important to note with that, it's a pretty limited number of participants that they're looking for.
Yep.
So this next question I can actually answer. One of the attendees was wondering, she is not sure if she is in the DSF family network, but thinks her husband is on the list. Is it okay for both parents to do it? Absolutely. On the back end, if we see 2 parents at the same address, we'll go ahead and join them in a household. So we would encourage you to do that. I do have a few questions, Nicole, that came in from folks that weren't able to attend. So the first one was, how can we as a community make sure that any clinical trial studies that are happening for Dravet syndrome are more patient-centered?
Sure. So that one, I would say, speak up, make your voice heard. You can contact pharmaceutical companies. There's usually an info email or some form of contact. If you know they're coming up, or if you think they have a drug in the market, you can contact them and let them know what your concerns are. It's okay. They may or may not be able to contact you back depending on the FDA regulations, but it's okay to let them know what you think. Speak up. If you're ever invited to be on a panel, either by one of these pharmaceutical companies or sometimes there are market research companies, and if you're comfortable, join the panel. They're looking for your opinion. They're looking to see what you have to say. So speak up anytime and every time you get an opportunity. Tell us, let us know in the Facebook page, let us know in our support group what's important to you. We get an idea of it, but we're always open to hearing, hey, you know what, this didn't work well for our community, and here's why I think it didn't. We're open to anything you guys have to say.
And I think it's important to note that the industry members want to know that information because they are putting a lot of money into these trials and they want to make sure it's successful. So they want to know if it's going to be difficult for patients to make, for instance, an appointment every week or every month. So they really do want to hear your opinion. The next question was, how can we even out any regional disparities and get all of our community members involved?
That is a great question. So we've tried a couple different approaches that we've been able to do, and one of them is moving these Day of Dravet workshops around. We're really, really trying to get all across the country so that everybody's reached. But there are some opportunities in maybe telehealth and telementoring that we're kind of pursuing. And I think those could be really great avenues to get the underserved or the more geographically isolated regions into this discussion. There's one called Project Echo, which is basically, it takes experts in a certain area. I can't remember, I think it might be just general pediatrics, experts in a certain area, and it connects them with pediatricians or people in rural areas who are not experts and allows them to ask questions. And it's kind of like a mentoring relationship. And it's kind of like telehealth, except between 2 doctors. So we're kind of looking at maybe exploring something like that. We're not anywhere near to actually doing it, but it's something that we talk about on these stakeholder calls.
And then another question that came in was, how can we make sure that our concerns and priorities are included not just in the outcome of a trial, but also for any possible harmful effects of any treatments?
That's a great question. Again, participate in panels, let people know what you think, let people know what you're concerned about. If you are participating in a trial and let's say you're doing a questionnaire at your office visit and the question is on behavior or the question is on gait or it's on something that's on your mind, make a note with your study coordinator, make a note, let them know that this is on your mind, let them know that you're concerned about this. And just keep talking, be the squeaky wheel. Just keep asking DSF, keep asking your ambassadors, keep asking the pharmaceutical companies. One other thing I forgot to mention is that a lot of these companies, as they're in the design process, because they are spending so much money on getting this treatment to market, will come to our 5Ks or come to our events. They're there, they want to listen, even if you can't make it you're not invited to speak on a panel or to be in a stakeholder meeting. Come out and see them and let them know what's on your mind, because they're there to interact with the community. So come out to our events and you'll probably see our sponsors there. You might see some quieter sponsors who are more at the starting point rather than the established clinical trials that are already happening. So come out to the events and speak up.
There is another question, and I'm afraid I don't know this, so I hope you know about it, Nicole. She asks, I believe that there was a study done on the autonomic system. Do you know what the results were?
I don't know if I can't see the question, so I don't know who asked it, but I assume she's talking about Dr. Beverly Weichels' dysautonomia study. I believe that was back in maybe 2009 or 2010, something like that. If it's a different study, I apologize and she can chime in. But the results of that were that our children or our patients have severe dysautonomic function. It's often a temperature dysregulation, which we kind of knew. She also saw circulation dysregulation, the cold hands, the cold feet, the sometimes hot and sweaty feet, cold and clammy. That was all circulatory. There's some thought that maybe the bladder incontinence that some of the older patients see might have something to do with dysautonomic dysfunction or autonomic dysfunction. I'm not sure what else she was looking for on that one.
But I would say too, if that didn't answer her question, like you said, she could certainly email you at Nicole at Dravet Foundation.
Yeah.
And then I think I'm understanding this next question correctly. We had someone who is asking, would we be better off to be in the butterfly study to benefit towards a genetic therapy cure? I think she means if we have, if you have a limited amount of time that you can give, where should it be spent?
That's a great question. So I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Marianne, but I believe the butterfly study is designed to be mostly incorporated with your regular neurology visits. So it's pretty minimal. There's not a lot required of you. There aren't invasive tests or anything like that. And so I think that there would be, I can't really see any barrier to participating in that one, especially since it is the one that is up and running now or will be shortly. It has a name, it's going. I don't see any barriers to participating in that. Even if you were at a study center that was eventually going to do their genetic approach and you wanted to leave the butterfly study to participate in the treatment study, that would be okay. So I don't see any barriers to participating in that one.
And
as far as where you should spend your time, there aren't a ton of choices right now, so it's a good one.
And she did follow up that question with whether or not they would be accepting adults in that study.
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that, but let me find out. And feel free to email me, Nicole at dravetfoundation.org.
And I
believe it was 2 to 18. Yeah. 2 to 18.
I think that you're right, and I don't even know if they have established where all of their sites will be and if they will only be in the US or if there will be any in Canada. But we can certainly, again, please email us and we can certainly find that out. Another question, is there a movement towards using SSRIs for prevention of SUDEP if you can't be on fenfluramine?
A movement? I don't know that I could say there's a movement. There have been a couple studies that have suggested that that may play a role in preventing the breathing cessation that they believe is part of the SUDIP process. There have been deaths of both mice and human patients on SSRIs of different families. So I can't say that it's a foolproof method, but there is some mechanistic reason to believe that it might be helpful. So I don't know if there's a movement, but it's definitely a question that's out there right now.
And I was just waiting. It looks like that is all of the questions, unless there's any last minute ones that are going to pop up. I don't know if there was anything else you wanted to add, Nicole.
No, just thank you all for being here tonight, and for anybody that watches the recording, thank you. You guys are amazing advocates for your patients, whether they're children or whether they're adults, and we're grateful that we have such an engaged, awesome community.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.